Hello, Faith family. Pastor Jason here. I'm excited to be back with you today as we continue our series, Joshua. In this series, we have studied and will continue to explore some amazing passages in the book of Joshua to see how he and the Israelites lived a life of faithfulness in difficult times. The focus of Sunday's sermon was that faith overcomes great obstacles. To highlight this, we looked at Joshua 6, verses 1 through 5 and verse 20, and how faith in God and his unusual instructions, as far as humans would understand, brought down the walls of Jericho. In last week's life group study, we looked at one of my favorite passages, 1 Kings 18, 20 through 39, where Elijah defeated the prophets of Baal through amazing faith in God. The passage from today's study is also one of my favorites, 2 Kings 6, 8 through 19. From this passage, we learn that faith in God achieves the unthinkable and defeats the enemies of God's people. There is one common theme in both of these passages: Elijah. He is one of the most significant and most extreme examples of what being a person of faith looks like. There are so many things that we can learn from Elijah, which is why I've chosen to look at him 2 weeks in a row in our life group studies. So far in this series, we've studied overcoming fear and responding in faith. The passage from today's study, 2 Kings 6, 18 through 19, is just one more example of how God will confront the enemies of his people. This passage clarifies how we should respond in faith and know that we have a faithful God who fights for us. However, doubt and fear is not the only thing that keeps us from responding in faith. Another common thing that keeps us from responding in faith is that we are distracted from the truth. So how do you see distraction in this passage? We see that Elijah's servant is so consumed with circumstances that he is facing that he forgets about the power of the God he serves. How real is this for us? Have you ever found yourself overwhelmed with a circumstance or an issue that you are facing? Did you allow the grand nature of this circumstance to create what I call provisional amnesia? Which means that we often forget how God has provided for us in the past through similar situations. There is so much white noise that we face and encounter every day. It seeks to drown out the voice of God and influence the Holy Spirit. Do you want to know how I see this most often? Usually, I see this in others seeking advice from friends and family before they seek God through prayer. Now, don't get me wrong, there's nothing terrible about seeking advice from friends and family. My issue with this is the sequence. We shouldn't seek human advice before we go to our Creator. Again, seeking human advice isn't bad, but it can indicate that our priorities are misaligned, that we are focusing on the wrong things of the world, and not things of God. What do these things look like? Maybe they look like fear or doubt or failure or defeat. Compare this to the fact that God promises that we have hope and that we will be victorious in Him. Now, let's dig a little deeper. Remember, I told you in a previous week's study that I like to think sometimes through a passage backwards, or to think about what an author is not saying. Let's do this now with the servant's response, because I feel it is a massive implication for us as believers and followers of Christ. I'm convinced that the servant knew that Elijah was spying for Israel because of his question, "What shall we do?" This indicates that the servant was expecting a fight at some point. If he had no expectations of this fight, then his response would have been more like, "What's happening, Elisha? Why is there an army around us? What have you done?" So, now you may be thinking, okay, Jason, that's an interesting little tidbit, but why does that matter for me? Well, I think it matters greatly. It shows us that even when we expect a future fight or a confrontation, that it can still be disorienting enough to make us respond without faith. I mean, look at 1 Peter 5:8. We are told explicitly to be sober-minded and watchful because our adversary, Satan, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. Is that not the quintessential warning to expect a spiritual fight and confrontation? We know Satan's role. He's our enemy, seeking to devour us. But how often are we caught off guard by a spiritual fight? One that we're expecting because we're not being vigilant or watchful, as 1 Peter 5 warns us to be. This passage is an excellent example of how often we act when confronted with a challenging circumstance. It is also a great example of how we should act in these circumstances. As people of faith, there should not be a difference between how we act and how we should act, but there often is. We should not be overwhelmed with the scope of our problem. Instead, we should look for God's provision in every difficult situation. God will confront the enemies of his people. Elisha demonstrates this for us, and that faith dwarfs the issue he is facing. He prays for God to strike the army with blindness, and then, without evidence, they were blind. He walks right up to those sent to capture him and starts a conversation. He had faith that God was greater than the issue he faced and that God would answer his prayers. This is how we can respond in faith, knowing that we have a faithful God who fights for us.